Millions of Americans line up at polling stations across the United States to choose between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris in a historic presidential race. To know more on the election, joining us live via Zoom is Samantha Gross, Director, Energy Security and Climate Initiative, who will talk about the U.S. election's preliminary result and the elected leader's policy on global energy. Hello, Samantha. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.
All right, Samantha, we already received the news that Donald Trump has given his victory remarks. So what role do you see the U.S. playing in shaping global renewable energy under Trump?
You know, soon-to-be President Trump, former President Trump, has focused a lot on fossil fuels. He's talked about that during his campaign. He focused on it during his previous presidency. He's talked a lot about making the U.S. even more dominant in terms of fossil fuels. But the truth of the matter is that he doesn't have much control over how much fossil fuels the U.S. produces. He says we're going to increase and increase, but he doesn't really have control over that. Those are business decisions made by U.S. companies. On the other hand, he doesn't much care for renewables, but the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest piece of climate legislation in U.S. history, is the law of the land. And I expect that to be durable, to stick around, and for the U.S. to continue
He doesn't
to
care
also
much about
invest
renewables, but if in combination
energy.
of fossil fuels, he'll be happy to just take the lower gas prices.
All right. How can the U.S. effectively support the emerging clean energy markets in developing countries that still rely on fossil fuels for economic growth?
So, I mean,
there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, the U.S. is making investments itself, which will be very helpful in bringing the costs down as we get better and better at developing these sorts of technologies. The other side of that is that the U.S. really needs to help finance investments in the developing world. That's going to be a big issue at the upcoming COP in Baku, Azerbaijan next week.
Oh, yeah, no, I'd love to hear it.
All right. How can a shift to renewable energy transform U.S. energy exports, and what are the implications for traditional oil and gas partnership?
You know, it's going to take a while for this shift to make a lot of difference in U.S. exports. Turning over the global energy system and the U.S. energy system in turn takes time. It's a multi-trillion-dollar system. And so I would expect the U.S. to continue to export oil, to export large quantities of natural gas as LNG, for that not to change a lot in the near term. But over time, as the demand for fossil fuels declines, particularly in the wealthy world, at that point, I would expect to see our production start to decline. But at this point, I expect us to be in the fossil fuel business for a while.
How should policymakers address potential job losses in traditional energy sectors to ensure a just transition for affected workers?
This is one of the most difficult questions because along with the United States' large oil and gas production, we have a lot of oil and gas jobs and a lot of our economy wrapped up in the fossil fuel industry. So as we transition, we need to think not just about climate change, but about the people involved in that industry and how to make sure that they can continue to have good jobs, maybe in the renewable energy industry, maybe in other forms of industry, but to really focus on those fossil fuel dependent areas as we think about new investments and economic growth. This certainly isn't the first time that we've seen industries turn over and change. That's part of a healthy, growing economy. It's just something that we're going to have to pay extra attention to in the coming years because this is such an important part of America's economy.
What can be implemented to balance U.S. energy security with a transition away from fossil fuels, especially in light of recent global energy challenges?
You know, actually, I think that these two, that moving away from fossil fuels and energy security can work together. If you think about the energy security challenges of both the present day, in terms of Russian supply, for instance, or in the past, thinking back to the supply challenges from OPEC in the 1970s, those were challenges with the delivery of fuel. Whereas when we're focused on renewables, there's no fuel involved. We're dealing with the sun, wind, geothermal power, perhaps nuclear power, where you have many fewer fueling cycles. So I actually see this shift towards forms of renewable energy as being more energy secure, not less, because we're not dependent on moving so much fuel around in the world.
How can the U.S. secure supply chain for critical materials used in renewable technologies, particularly in the context of competition with other nations?
That is a terrific question, and one that's very, very live in the United States. Because China has really invested heavily in supply chains for many different kinds of materials, many critical materials, even ones they don't mine themselves. And many of those materials, they dominate the refining of them, taking from an ore to a useful material. And what the United States needs to do with its friends, with its allies around the world is work to diversify supply chains in these products. There is security in diversity. And so having more sources of these minerals would be very helpful. And I think the United States needs to focus not just on doing it ourselves, but on working with others around the world to have more robust supply chains.
All right, Samantha Gross, Director of Energy Security and Climate Initiative, thank you for talking to TVR World.